Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 25th NUS Cities Public Lecture. Before we start the event, please ensure your devices are on silent mode or powered off. For those who don't know about NUS Cities, we are a university-wide, multidisciplinary, open and inclusive collaborative platform hosted within the College of Design and Engineering. Through our collaborations with local and international institutions, we hope to create synergies that extend within as well as beyond NUS. The NUS Cities Public Lecture Series will investigate policies, ideas, and projects developed by urban experts which aspire to create sustainable, resilient, and livable cities. Through the lecture series, we hope to create a platform for discussion, retrospection, and conversation to give momentum to the ongoing research and exploration regarding issues concerning cities. Now I would like to introduce our speaker of this evening. Dr. Stefan Huebner is the president of the Society of Floating Solutions, Singapore, deputy chair of the International Scientific Committee for the Annual World Conference on Floating Solutions, and a senior research fellow at the ARI-NUS. In 2019, he served as a US SSRC Trans-Regional Research Fellow at Harvard University, where he was previously a Fulbright Scholar in 2018. In 2016, he was a History and Public Policy Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He's working on the history, present, and future of ocean industrialization and new forms of urbanization that became possible through floating structures. His monograph on the topic Earth's Amphibious Transformation will be released by Cambridge University Press in late 2025. Recent articles were published in Ocean and Coastal Management, Channel News Asia, and Asia Global Online. Together with the International Scientific Committee, he is working on a series of policy recommendations and white papers on floating solutions in urban contexts. Please join me in welcoming him on stage.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, this seems to be good. And it's wonderful to see that so many people are interested in floating solutions. 10 years ago, I think there may have been 10% of the people in the room here. And 100 years ago, you could argue that nobody would have been here because everybody would have known already about floating structures, which will be one of the points in my presentation later, how we managed somehow to forget floating structures in development. But first and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers of the event and NUS Cities, in particular Professor Ko, and then also the organizing team for inviting me. And I would also like to mention again that I'm president of the Society of Floating Solutions Singapore, and at the end of the presentation, I want to briefly come back to that topic and to some of our activities. But altogether, the point of this lecture is to explore why floating buildings and structures like floating solar PV systems, but also residential structures, commercial structures, and so on, matter for urban growth and for helping coastal cities adapt to climate change. Growth is driven by many familiar factors. There are political ones, economic ones, demographic ones, and so on. But today I want to focus on how floating solutions can contribute in a, if possible, sustainable way. My emphasis, I should also mention, on urban settings, so I will not delve into floating applications for mariculture, that is marine organism, fish farming, and I will also not address, for example, offshore energy generation. This is, for example, offshore wind energy and so on, even though they are related to urbanization in the sense that they are supplying cities with power and also with food. Now, consider climate adaptation. Climate change is largely, but not entirely, a series of water-related problems, and coastal cities face a host of water-related challenges. There are rising sea levels, increasing groundwater levels that reduce seepage during heavy rainfall. There are more intense storms and storm surges to be expected, and there's also growing freshwater demand due to rising temperatures, which can result in over-extraction of groundwater followed by ground subsidence. You have heard about, I think, many sinking cities such as Jakarta. These issues documented by the IPCC, that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and other researchers strongly raise flood risks. Asian countries, including China, India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and the Philippines, alongside, in particular, the Netherlands in Europe, are most at risk of coastal flooding disasters. There's a variety of studies on that topic now, but Singapore is also expecting substantially more than 1 meter of sea level rise in this century. And while climate change is a major driving force today, I should also call to attention that flooding has been a persistent challenge, from seasonal snowmelt and monsoon rains to natural water level rises following the last ice age that nobody really remembers anymore, but it has been there before. One promising adaptation strategy is what is called the advanced strategy. There's an overview by Jörg Baumeister and others regarding climate adaptation strategies for cities, and advanced means basically to remove parts of urbanization onto aquatic surfaces. And in 2022, for example, the IPCC began evaluating floating structures as experimental forms of climate adaptation. There's also some other buildings that I want to show you. I want to mention, for example, that the Global Center on Adaptation in Rotterdam in the Netherlands has opened a floating office building in 2021, which is a practical solution rather than just a utopian idea. Its design is in some ways echoing Dutch houseboats, which means that it rises and falls together with the water level. Similarly, initiatives like the Floating Future project in the Netherlands are exploring large-scale floating settlements. The potential of floating designs has also caught the attention of global institutions. For example, the United Nations in 2019 organized a roundtable on sustainable floating cities, led by Deputy Secretary General Amina J. Mohamed. And in 2021, a prototype project was announced for the South Korean port city Busan for up to 12,000 people. Follow-up discussions in 2022 with UN Habitat, now involved, underline the growing momentum in this field. There are also several more examples that I would like to mention. In the Maldives, which is a country that is severely threatened by sea level rise in this century, the government has signed an agreement to build a suburb of floating homes for roughly 20,000 residents. And the first prototype was delivered in spring 2024, about 1 year ago. In Saudi Arabia, the NEOM project for a new, highly modern city that you may have heard about at the Red Sea includes plans for a floating settlement called Oxagon. I do not claim that all of these plans will be realized during the next 10 years. Some may come to fruition, some others may be replaced by more efficient ideas, but what I would like to mention is that all of them represent proactive steps toward managing flood risks. It is important to note that this advanced strategy is different from traditional terrestrial flood risk management, as I think you have already seen here. While amphibious buildings that rise during floods are still needed on land, as well as seawalls and other coastal protections, floating structures provide an opportunity to shift urban development onto aquatic spaces, to avoid flood-prone areas, to complement new coastal protection systems, or to make use of new locations like, for example, water reservoirs. What we are witnessing is also a shift in mindset from what I will call a terrestrial mindset to an amphibious awareness. There's a growing social acceptance of floating buildings, which means that we are moving away from a purely terra-centric approach that has long dominated urban planning in many Western cities. Instead of relying almost exclusively on coastal defenses like seawalls or land reclamation or a retreat to higher ground, we are beginning to see the benefits of integrating our aquatic spaces. However, scaling up these projects for effective flood risk management and reducing environmental footprints remains an important challenge. I therefore want to show some examples and combine this with a discussion of benefits. I will also talk about deficits in the second part of this presentation. So let me share a brief overview of some floating structures already in use. The first one, I think a lot of you know, this is the former float at Marina Bay, which served as a floating event platform for sports and cultural performances. The second one is, I think, also somewhat well known. This is the Sembcorp Tenge floating solar farm that generates renewable energy while also reducing evaporation from a water reservoir, which is a key benefit for a city with limited fresh water. This is a floating bridge at Big Sisters Island in Singapore that not only connects areas to each other, but also creates habitat space for marine organisms, supporting local biodiversity. This here is a floating deck, complete with swimming pools at a condominium in Singapore at the former King's Dock, very close to Harbourfront, and provides recreational spaces without the need for land reclamation. These pools also offer safe, filtered water conditions, in contrast to coastal waters that may be polluted or too cold for swimming or unsafe due to sharks, jellyfish, and so on. And I'm not only talking here about Singapore. I mean, it's not that cold in winter, if you know what I mean. But we also see this, for example, here in Helsinki in Finland, and there it is really getting cold during winter time, and actually warmed pool is then an opportunity for people to swim. The next slide here are floating homes in Feyenoord in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Such high-tech floating buildings have been built since the first decade of the 21st century. They typically last between 50 to 100 years, longer in freshwater than in saltwater, and are not futuristic. Their designs, usually using EPS, that's expanded polystyrene, foundations encased in concrete, make them virtually unsinkable. Here are some floating homes in Lelystad in the Netherlands. This is a floating home in Panama, actually designed by a Dutch architect. And here are some floating houses in the Bärwalder See in Saxony in Germany. So cost-wise, while floating buildings may run about 10% higher than their terrestrial counterparts, this figure must also be balanced against the savings on land reclamation costs and the shorter construction timelines, as it takes years for reclaimed land to settle, not to mention the smaller environmental footprint. Centralized mass production and towing to the site of use instead of on-site construction can further reduce energy demand. Mobility can mean lifespan extension through redeployment instead of demolition. Construction and demolition are very energy-intensive moments, after all, that can cause large carbon emissions. Singaporean and many Asian cities' urban planning is much more focused on high-rises than on single-family homes, and I will come back to that topic later. But currently, my goal, I should mention, is to illustrate that such high-tech floating homes have already been built and that other purposes, not only residential ones, also matter, both for climate adaptation and for urban growth. This includes recreational structures, commercial and cultural buildings, and floating green energy generation. I will return to Singapore and several other cities later with a focus on the present transformation of the urban waterfronts. But first, here, another photo. This is a floating hotel with several buildings in Klädesholmen in Sweden. This now is a very recently built cultural building, the Floating Theater in Lyon in France. This is an older building, the Floating Pavilion in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and it is used in a former port space, which underwent redevelopment. The same port redevelopment is happening in many cities, as I mentioned, including Singapore and Busan in South Korea. And this one is a floating island or park in Baltimore in the United States. In Singapore, there's also research underway on floating islands for mangrove forest growth and floating planters with trees. These initiatives aim to enhance coastal protection against storm surges and boost local biodiversity by extending coastal habitats, a complement to natural mangrove ecosystems. And to prevent misunderstandings, mangroves usually grow along coastlines, so floating mangrove islands would be an addition. I do not suggest them as a substitute. And now let me delve into the benefits of floating solutions in some more detail and offer a short summary before we can move on to some of the problems. When we talk about climate adaptation and flood risk reduction, the challenges extend beyond just sea level rise. Groundwater over-extraction and urban sinking are also major issues. Shifting urban functions onto aquatic surfaces offers an alternative to traditional land-centered strategies, such as retreating to higher ground or engaging in large-scale land reclamation. Moreover, floating structures can even serve as coastal protection measures on their own or in combination with land-based approaches. But the important thing is also that this advanced strategy can work alongside other adaptation strategies. Floating structures also bring features that land-based buildings simply cannot provide. They can be designed to support aquatic biodiversity, essentially acting as tools for ecological engineering. There's also an important sustainability angle. Think of renewable energy generation. Floating solar PV systems, for example, benefit from an efficiency increase of 3 to 5% due to improved cooling in the water. Additionally, floating solar PV systems and other floating structures covering part of an aquatic surface help reduce evaporation from water reservoirs. Another key advantage is the inherent mobility of these structures, which can extend their operational lifespan by moving them to other places after they are not needed anymore at a certain place. And now we can turn to social acceptance, and things are getting a bit more problematic. I want to address the current deficits of floating structures and discuss how many of these challenges stem from a long-standing terror-centric mindset, meaning that many can actually be removed. In other words, I want to briefly show how decades or even centuries of focusing solely on land-based urbanization have led to limited awareness and acceptance of floating solutions. Studies on coastal climate adaptation, like one from Jamero and her team in 2017, have shown that people tend to favor in situ solutions over relocation to higher ground, which is maybe not surprising. After all, relocation of people from a coastline to higher ground is a move that in many cases, depending on the country and the region we are talking about, can be fraught with issues from governance challenges. Think of corruption, think of incapable authorities, to negative psychological impacts on the people who have to leave their homes. Yet, despite this preference, the idea of advancing urban functions onto aquatic surfaces has met with limited social acceptance. For instance, a 2009 survey in the Netherlands found that only about 30% of respondents saw living on water as viable, even in a country that is very familiar with houseboats. And in northern Jakarta, an area expected to face significant inundation by 2050, around 44% of people were open to the idea of floating solutions in a much more recent survey, yet only 21% thought that it was the best approach. However, in both cases, the lack of familiarity with high-tech floating solutions played a key role. People very often only during the interview learned that such solutions exist. And I also want to talk now a bit more about different types of social acceptance. First, there's socio-political acceptance. This covers institutional support and endorsement by policymakers and key stakeholders. Then we have here the market acceptance, which reflects the willingness of consumers, investors, and businesses to adopt and financially support these initiatives. And then the third one, community acceptance involves the perceptions and responses of local residents, especially those directly impacted. These dimensions are interdependent. Without solid socio-political backing, for example, market acceptance tends to falter. There's no reason for people to invest in something if there are no regulations for it, or if the government may at any point in time forbid such approaches. I would like to mention that some people feel uncomfortable due to the movement of structures, but this is altogether a minor issue. It's not that frequent, and it is also not a reason for these people to actually automatically be against floating solutions as an adaptation strategy. They may not want to live themselves on them, but this doesn't prevent them from leaving this to other people. Much more important is that floating structures are rarely integrated into urban or regional planning, and they receive scant attention in university curricula in countries like Germany, Japan, and Singapore, according to my knowledge. There are also lingering concerns about ecological impacts, often amplified by negative associations with low-tech floating or stilted buildings that historically very often released all their waste, all their excrements, and so on just into the water, which obviously is not very appealing today. Additionally, there are also very unappealing conditions on offshore settlements related to the oil and gas industry. And then there are also long-standing tensions between modern state-centric systems focused on fixed national borders, fixed immobile is very important, real estate, and also sedentary lifestyles that facilitate taxation versus historically more mobile libertarian lifestyles, if you want to call them like that. Here in Asia, think, for example, of these so-called sea nomads, the orang laut being one of the mobile groups that were very difficult to integrate into modern, very immobile, border-centered state systems. Just to first illustrate one of these points, this is Neft Dashlari, a Soviet-era oil town built on stilts in the Caspian Sea. So this one is not floating. And once in the 1970s, at its peak, it housed about 5,000 residents, mostly oil workers. Yet these settlements never gained social acceptance as models for urban living. Arguably, most of you have never even heard of them, I would guess. Similarly, floating offshore oil platforms are not considered role models. Here's another image more recently of viable structures on sea surfaces. They lack amenities like family spaces, greeneries, and even often very basic comfort. There are no children allowed, no pets, and many, many, many more prohibitions. Then we have another much more well-known example, I think, cruise ships, which are essentially mobile settlements, but they are also far from being seen as long-term, and I mean long-term, living solutions by the general public, even though some crew members may accept the conditions as part of their job. Let's now turn to low-tech structures and monsoon adaptation as another example. Throughout history and still today, indigenous communities have developed vernacular designs of floating buildings and houseboats to cope with the rapid water level changes brought on by monsoons. While Asia is most commonly associated with these practices, similar adaptation approaches can be found wherever the global monsoon system operates, which you can see marked here. So you actually have many more regions than Asia. But consider, for example, the floating homes on Lake Tempe in Sulawesi in Indonesia. During the rainy season, as the lake expands, residents move their homes toward the center of the lake, where the best fisheries are found. This saves them considerable travel time by boat compared to residing in terrestrial buildings. Then, during the dry season, these homes shift to parts of the lake that retain water, while the people relocate to second homes, terrestrial homes along the coast, which the seasonal flooding has fertilized for farming. So they are using the movements, the up and down of the lake for the most efficient economic purposes and have the corresponding accommodations for that. A parallel example of low-tech monsoon adaptation comes from Lake Titicaca in Peru in South America, shaped by the South American monsoon system. Here, during the rainy season, the surrounding Andes Mountains trap precipitation, strongly increasing water inflow, so the lake rises substantially. The indigenous people have long built floating islands from totora reed to adapt to these seasonal water level changes. You can see one example here, even though they also integrated some more modern tools like motorboats and so on. These low-tech monsoon adaptation practices, which were refined over centuries, remind us that advancing urban functions onto aquatic surfaces for climate adaptation continues a viable, time-tested strategy for managing flood risks. Yet despite their functionality in monsoon regions, such practices are rarely embraced in high-income countries. In many places across Asia, South America, and West Africa, these indigenous solutions are seen more as tourist curiosities. Think of floating markets in Vietnam, for example, or think of Venice in Europe, which is more not to the past, to the Renaissance and so on, but not seen as a modern practical strategy. Venice, I should mention, is based on stilts, and I will come to this difference later in the presentation. This brings us to a deeper point about the terrestrial mindset that I also address in my forthcoming book on Earth's amphibious transformation. For decades or centuries, depending on location, our approach to water management has been dominated by energy-intensive water control and removal purposes. The age of coal, which, depending on location, began in the 18th, 19th, or 20th century, marked a very important turning point because of the huge amounts of energy that became available through this fossil fuel. Steam engines, first used for draining coal mines, eventually sparked a land reclamation revolution in 19th century Europe through steam pumps that replaced the very well-known windmills, for example, in the Netherlands, where large-scale land reclamation was going on. They replaced these windmills with steam pumps. And this is then one of the main reasons for very successful land reclamation that spread all over the world in the 20th century. Moreover, cheap energy also allowed the mass manufacturing of energy-intensive construction materials. Think, for example, of concrete, steel, glass, bricks, which all became widespread. These were not necessarily new materials, but I'm talking here about the quantitative dimension and the possibilities that emerged and that in the 19th century began to transform urban landscapes in Europe. Hydroelectric dams, seawalls, and extensive drainage systems using large quantities of energy-intensive concrete and steel also redefined urban developments. Water control and removal, such as river floodplains, in combination with electricity generation and freshwater provision, which is something that a hydroelectric dam can do, promoted a land-based mode of urban growth, supported by seawalls. These technologies enabled what you might call terrestrialization, a process that sidelined low-tech floating structures, stilted structures, and houseboats made from wood, reed, or bamboo. Just a reminder here that you have seen before. In a way, the global adoption of energy-intensive water management methods rendered these adaptive low-tech solutions as backward or even primitive, removing the limited social acceptance that they previously had. One can find many examples. And I also want to show this one here again, which is more tourist attraction, I think, for many people than a serious solution for living. The example that I really want to briefly cover now is the Japanese colonial empire and the long-term impacts related to hydroelectric dams. What you can see here is the Sukbong Dam between Korea and Manchuria, which was under construction in the early 1940s. Japanese project also related to colonial control of this area. But what is also very noteworthy is the gigantic amount of concrete and steel that went into this dam. So building this earlier would have been extremely difficult before the age of coal came to East Asia. Here's another example. One can find hundreds of them, but this here is from Indonesia from the 1970s and 1980s, a dam that was then built by Japanese dam building experts, some of whom had actually gained their experience in the colonial empire. And then fast forward here to the 21st century. This is arguably one of the most well-known hydroelectric dams in the world, the Three Gorges, completed in 2006. And once again, I mean, it's a demonstration of gigantic amounts of concrete, steel, and so on that went into this construction, not to mention transportation of all the construction materials to the site. And then, I mean, you have all seen seawalls before. This is a Japanese seawall. It's another demonstration of large amounts of concrete being mobilized for protecting coastlines. So altogether, there was no age of coal in aquatic spaces, and aquatic buildings largely vanished and lost social acceptance. For sure, there were steamships that operated using coal and were made from energy-intensive steel, but their actual impact was that people now were able to move faster from location to location. So the time spent interacting with aquatic environments on these temporary accommodations was actually reduced. And small floating settlements in the form of oil platforms, if you want to consider them as floating settlements, did not appear until the age of coal, the age of oil, which is in the mid-20th century. And they also had very limited or no social acceptance as models for floating urban structures, meaning that the terrestrial mindset in urban planning and now in climate adaptation intensified, depending on location, for decades or for more than 1 century. Now let me share another example highlighting issues of social acceptance, this one a pretty drastic one. In 1967 and 1968, the controversial US designer Buckminster Fuller, whom you can see here, proposed a modular floating city called Triton City, which became part of Boston's bid to host the 1976 World Exposition. Fuller had already built the US pavilion for the exposition in 1976 in Montreal, which you can see here. So the idea of him contributing an experimental floating residential structure was not that surprising. However, when plans were made as part of the Expo application to later convert the Expo facilities into public housing, strong opposition arose. In South Boston, there was a very strong anti-segregationist community which had their political representatives. And if you now consider that the exposition site was at South Boston's Waterfront, you can imagine that the expectation that large numbers of black people would be moved to this public housing project resulted in a strong negative backlash. So the local community leaders in South Boston then sabotaged the application to a degree in Washington that it was not feasible anymore. And that is basically the end of this story. Well, it is one of the explanations why Fuller's project never was realized. That all being said, US segregation issues are not that relevant for Singapore and many other cities, but I want to emphasize that differences in income levels can have impacts on social acceptance, or more generally, this is a reminder that community feedback can be negative if the development of aquatic spaces happens without considering the situation in already inhabited terrestrial parts of the urban waterfront. Also problematic is the development of aquatic parts of urban waterfronts without the consent of authorities. This can happen if no guidelines are in place, as the next examples will show. This here is a Dutch houseboat. I think all of you have seen something like that before, but these houseboats can also provide telling examples. So in both the Netherlands and the United States, houseboats are often associated with libertarian, hippie, so to speak, lifestyles from the 1960s related to the Back to the Water movement as an alternative to the Back to the Land movement. And as you can imagine, these libertarian-minded people were not really interested in working with authorities to implement any regulations, which is one of the reasons why very often regulations were just not implemented, or why people were systematically trying to evade them. In some ways, you can compare this to the situation in parts of Asia when we talk about the sea nomads and the colonial and post-colonial governmental authorities in Asia that wanted to make them sedentary, for example, in Indonesia. But you can come back to the houseboats, which are often seen, I think, as romantic, even amusing, but also impractical or maybe absurd by mainstream society. And this one here, can you see the train car? I mean, there's a train car in it if you focus especially on the left side. And you can ask yourself, how many of you have a train car integrated into your apartment or your house? It's probably not too many people. Yeah, so, I mean, as mentioned, more eccentric. Also, let us take this example here of a floating doghouse seriously, at least for a little bit. By examining it, we can better understand both the shortcomings and the potential solutions that could enhance social acceptance. Think about it. How does the dog actually get off this floating structure here? Probably the dog jumps onto the jetty in the back. But just imagine what social acceptance would you find, at least among humans, if the only way how you access a floating structure is by jumping on and off it. It's very limited. And now, I mean, even though this is maybe a funny example, what I was talking about here is a problem for low-tech stilted structures. If the water level goes down, access to a stilted structure usually is only possible via ropes, via stairs, ladders, and so on, or via some form of bridge connection that substantially increases the time you need to get to the structure, which is different in the case of modern high-tech floating solutions. There's also another important issue to consider. Some of you maybe attended the last NUS Cities lecture on New Taipei, and there was a longer section about toilets. So you can now wonder what happens to the excrement of the dog. I mean, maybe it goes into the water. This is something we, I think, don't want. But it is something, it is a deficit associated with a lot of low-tech houseboats, floating homes, and stilted structures that send all their waste, the wastewater, and so on, into the water, leading to pollution, over-fertilization, and the spread of disease. High-tech floating buildings, however, use flexible pipes and cables to link buildings to jetties and to public water and also power grids, allowing sewage to be pumped out and treated in sewage plants, just like in any terrestrial building. Unfortunately, the absence of clear regulations, construction codes, and guidelines for floating structures often leads to problems. whether it's self-built structures lacking proper water and sewage treatment or congestion on busy waterways that raises safety concerns. In North America, for example, recent newspaper articles highlight such conflicts. I quote one of them. The state says the floating camps are blocking the views from houses and camps onshore, posing pollution risks and creating congestion at public docks and boat ramps. Some are even being used as seasonal rental properties. Because they are not solidly onshore, these camps are beyond the reach of private property boundaries and shore regulations that protect the water and fishery from pollution. And because Maine doesn't have a clear definition of what is a boat and what is not, there is no consensus of what regulations apply to these structures. End of the quotation. This is from Bangor Daily News from US Federal State of Maine from August 2024, less than 1 year ago. Similar problems can also be found in another example, an article from the Canadian press in October 2023 regarding Ontario. On July 1st, 2023, Ontario Regulation 161/17 was amended to clarify that floating accommodations cannot be placed or used for outdoor accommodation or camping purposes on public land covered by water. So this is a general prohibition of their use in public waters, which apparently previously did not exist. In short, without proper regulations covering construction codes, urban planning and zoning, taxation, property law, and environmental or heritage impact assessments, social acceptance of floating structures remains very limited. Legal and social conflicts can have further negative impacts. This regulatory vacuum also discourages developers from investing money and causes problems for individuals due to the non-availability of mortgages, insurance, and so on that are essential for investing in a home. Another problem is the still insufficient knowledge about environmental impacts, which matters for environmental impact assessments. Shade casting is an issue, but it depends on a variety of factors. I mean, the sun is changing the direction during the course of the day, so depending on the design of a floating structure, you do not necessarily have permanent shade casting. Corrosion, for example, of solar panels, whether this is on land or on the water, can lead to metal pollution, which is another issue. Recycling of floating structures is also a topic that needs regulation. There's also usually some water warming and oxygen level reduction below floating structures. Also, studies so far have shown no dangerous levels to aquatic life. Another issue, at least in some cases, are potential biological invasions by aquatic organisms, which can spread between ships and boats, but also floating structures, port infrastructures made from concrete, seawalls, rocky shorelines, and so on. But this can be influenced and inhibited through the use of microhabitats that increase local biodiversity when installed on the submerged parts of floating structures. This is a topic that we will actually cover in another event, but there are articles in biology journals by Catherine Daffon, Nina Schaefer, and others, and somewhat related when we talk here about Singaporean seawalls and the installation of microhabitats to increase biodiversity. Peter Todd and his team at NUS are working on these approaches. When we talk about already urbanized coastal spaces, not about new development zones, I should mention that the ideal point in time for integration of floating structures is when the terrestrial parts are getting redeveloped and amphibious urban planning can take place. So now I want to turn to 3 Asian cities where floating solutions can play different roles. Singapore faces an almost unique challenge, as I think you know. Extremely limited space both on land and at sea, coupled with busy shipping lanes and designated protected or military areas. For those interested, a recent book by Giuseppe Torrisi, Daniela Procopio, and Lim Soon Heng on the floating towns of tomorrow explores floating settlement ideas for such spaces in Singapore. In our context here, I want to talk about several other relevant examples. Generally, I want to emphasize that Singapore has some locational benefits. Singapore has calm waters, no typhoons, and substantial sunshine. This is also the case for nearby Indonesian islands. Think, for example, of Batam, Bintan, and so on, to which I will come back soon. Altogether, this is beneficial for floating buildings, but also for solar PV systems, but not so much, for example, for offshore wind energy. But first, consider the water reservoir that is part of the Long Island plan here in Singapore. This plan proposes a new water reservoir adjacent to East Coast Park, protected by a mix of land reclamation and coastal defenses. By the way, our former society president Lim Soon Heng suggested increasing the water reservoir while reducing land reclamation, as freshwater storage is, after all, a priority for the government. And some ideas can be found on our website. But here, let's focus on the current proposal and add some floating solutions. Installing recreational floating structures like swimming pools, water sports rental shops, or restaurants within the reservoir can free up valuable space for parks and other uses. This is all structures that anyway would be built. Floating solar PV systems are also an option. By partially covering a reservoir, they reduce evaporation and help conserve freshwater, which is, after all, the point of a freshwater reservoir. The redevelopment of Singapore's greater southern waterfront, including the Pasir Panjang Power District and various terminals that you can see here on this image from the Urban Redevelopment Authority website, offers further opportunities. Here we are talking about a redevelopment situation as port facilities are being shifted to Tuas megaport in the west. So integrating floating buildings and recreational structures could provide additional residential or recreational space, helping to balance urban density on land. And beyond that, Singapore's urban marine spaces, even small so-called dead zones that can't be used for other purposes, can host floating solar arrays. I also want to briefly come back to floating mangrove forests and even breakwaters. Of course, increasing social acceptance for such ideas hinges on having a clear legal framework, defined responsibilities when we talk about government agencies, attention in university curriculums, and better public education on floating structures. And now, Jakarta. Jakarta, the sinking city, the former capital of Indonesia. We have heard about the issue of the urban sinking because of the over-extraction of groundwater. And I should mention, there are cities like Tokyo which had the same problem, but managed to solve the problem in the 20th century. One of the obvious solutions, even though it is difficult to implement, is the creation of additional water reservoirs. There's actually arguably not a way around, because people are extracting this groundwater among other reasons, because this is the main way how they can actually get access to drinking water. So alternative ways of providing drinking water is the way out of this sinking situation. And then we can talk about floating solutions again, from floating homes to floating solar PV systems that, once again, as I mentioned before, can cover part of the water reservoir and reduce evaporation, keeping more water in the reservoir, which, after all, needs to fill during the rainy season and then retain enough water until the next rainy season. One of the big problems, obviously, is to find enough space for that. So if the evaporation is reduced, it means less space demand for such water reservoirs. The situation is generally different if you have a situation in which there's not yet a large-scale urbanization project happening, as I mentioned before, when you have more options. I also want to mention that ZERIS, the Singapore's Solar Energy Research Institution, here at NUS has done studies, and Indonesia has a gigantic solar energy potential, which includes, for example, Bintan, Batam, and so on. So islands that are nearby, which can provide electricity not only to the local people, but also to Singapore. There's an ongoing project for a large solar PV system in the reservoir in Batam, but I think there's also a need for focusing some attention regarding the waters around these islands, because they are relatively calm. There's no typhoons happening there, so there are more connections between them and Singapore in terms of energy connections, I think. And then finally, I want to turn again to Busan in South Korea, where we can see a city undergoing major transformations. Large-scale pod redevelopment is creating opportunities to integrate floating structures into urban planning. UN Habitats and Oceanics Sustainable Floating City Project is one such initiative. Busan is South Korea's most flood-prone area, and floating structures here could greatly reduce flood risks and bolster climate adaptation. Busan also has an important shipyards and related industries cluster, which is in some ways similar to Singapore, which is one reason for local stakeholders there to work on this floating settlement project. However, conditions in Busan are more challenging than, for example, in Singapore. Unlike equatorial regions, Busan regularly faces typhoons and rough seas. Additionally, the earlier association of the floating city project with Busan's bid for the World Expo 2030, which ultimately went to Saudi Arabia, as you have heard, had impacts on social acceptance. While world expositions can help introduce new technologies, an association with them is also problematic, as they may not happen, similar to the brief example that I mentioned earlier with Buckminster Fuller. Or they can become associated with events years in the future. In other words, informing Expo participants about new technologies can create social acceptance, which is important if it happens. But even more important is to also work on increasing such social acceptance now, really now, and to include the many types of floating structures into climate adaptation strategies and urban growth. So what we need are clear regulations and guidelines, defined responsibilities among public agencies, university curricula that include these new ideas, and a commitment to scaling up small, successful projects. Only by addressing these factors can we move beyond our entrenched terrestrial mindset and fully embrace a holistic, amphibious approach to urban planning and climate adaptation. By combining practical design solutions with strong institutional support and public education, we can unlock the potential of floating structures, not just as technological curiosities, but as integral components of sustainable, resilient urban land and seascapes. While this was the conclusion of the main part of my talk, let me briefly mention a few of our society activities that serve to increase knowledge about floating solutions for sustainable urban growth and climate adaptation. So just in case you are interested, this is our website, which you can access via the QR code, but can also easily look up on the internet. You can find our mission statement here regarding sustainability and also regarding climate adaptation and a number of other topics such as related to floating structures. We are also organizing on the 7th of March next month a site visit of this floating solar farm here in Singapore. You can sign up for that if you're interested. Non-members are very welcome. As mentioned, you can look this up on our website. I want to go through the slides here. Then we have an event co-hosted with NUS, with ARI, my institute, which takes place in March, where we address, as I already mentioned, the sinking cities in more detail. It's called Sea Level Rise and Floating Structures Along Asian Coastlines, new adaptation strategies for singing cities like Jakarta and others. Registration is free on Zoom. This is an online roundtable. And then we have also in September our annual World Conference on Floating Solutions, this time taking place in Finland. This is an opportunity for people who may want to present on floating solutions to sign up for the event. Abstract submission has opened, and if you have ideas for floating solutions, if you are interested in networking or discussions, you are very welcome at the event. There's also a technical tour of a variety of floating solutions in the Helsinki Espoo area. Yeah, and this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for that inspiring lecture. I would now like to invite on stage the moderator for the evening, Prof. Lau Yingming. Prof. Lau Yingming is currently an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He focuses on offshore engineering with a particular emphasis on reliability analysis. Please join me in welcoming him on stage. And I would now like to invite the audience in the auditorium to raise their questions.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be the moderator. Where should I stand? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I understand that this is an opportunity not just for questions for the speaker, but also for discussion, public discussion. So that's why we need a moderator to facilitate this discussion. So first of all, I'd like to also thank Dr. Stefan Huebner for this very interesting talk covering a historical perspective into the modern era where we have many situations such as adaptation to climate change and urban solutions. So with that, do we have any questions or any comments, or anyone wants to start the discussion? If so, please introduce yourself, and then, or are there any suggestions? Okay, maybe I can start the ball rolling. So that is my job, while you can ponder about what are the more important questions. I think Dr. Huebner, you mentioned a lot about social acceptance, right? I mean, as one of the impediments to adoption of floating solutions. So other than this social acceptance, are there other kind of like challenges, like what are technological challenges, like are there costs or maybe materials or other kind of challenges beyond just socially?
Yeah, I mean, there are a variety of challenges. I mean, here again, I limit myself to more urban structures and leave out offshore structures, oil industry or gas industry and so on. So technical challenges still exist, but I think since initial floating homes were built already in the first decade of the 20th century, a number of these technical challenges have been addressed. When we talk about mooring, for example, that would be one topic. That there's for sure lots of space for improvements, but I mean, it is one of the topics that is important because mooring is the difference between a floating home and a houseboat. A houseboat, you would not connect to the seabed, for example, in a port in the Netherlands. This is a legal question or legal necessity that then has impacts on engineering decisions. We are also talking about questions related to recycling of these structures. Floating homes, floating buildings is one issue. When we talk about floating solar panels, I already mentioned this is a somewhat different story because recycling is even more important. So this is a challenge. Corrosion is an issue. Here one needs to differentiate, between, as I already briefly mentioned, freshwater and saltwater. So it depends really on the location. And social acceptance also has many facets, as I mentioned, which is comprised of legal issues, but also lack of knowledge, for example. So I think integrating this knowledge into university systems across faculties is important. So it's not only about engineering, it's also about architecture, it's also about anthropologists, for example, who can do surveys, who can also study, for example, the vernacular designs that I mentioned, from which we, to a certain degree, can learn something. There's also the issue of biology that I briefly addressed, which is reconnected to the engineering questions, how to increase biodiversity, marine biodiversity or freshwater biodiversity, since this is one of the important topics here.
Okay. Anyone has any questions on this? Or further discussion? Yes? You want to provide a mic?
Postgraduate from urban planning. I wonder why do they choose floating space rather than underwater to deal with sea level rise? Is it cost or cost?
You mean underwater in the sense of the seabed?
Underwater city or
I mean, floating is something that is already tested. I mean, something that in low tech forms has been done since millennia. Underwater is problematic. I mean, that there's a variety of factors that come to mind from experiments since the 1960s that were given up because of accessibility. Another issue is also communication in water, especially in salt water. I mean, our entire communication system happens above the sea surface. Radio waves don't really work that well in water. Actually, you don't get very far. You get a couple of meters. Ask any Cold War submarine captain. So you can do sound-based systems, but I mean, you would do this all with cables for communication purposes. So this is another challenge. And generally, it's a bit like I think living in outer space in an environment where you can, in theory, die very quickly if something goes wrong. So on a floating structure, you can build this that it will not sink. And even if it sinks, you can build it in a way that it will not drown you, depending on the water depth and so on. So I think there are substantial challenges in terms of technology and also in terms of social acceptance for anything that is not happening on the surface, be that a terrestrial surface or aquatic surface.
So really, floating city, what they are near to, and how will urban planners build those?
I mean, this is one of the big questions of the future, and it's a very important one because we need definitely more amphibious planning that integrates aquatic spaces much more than has been done so far. Very often this is the responsibility of a public authority responsible for water reservoirs that focuses exactly on water reservoirs, but not necessarily on broader questions of urbanization, or port authority that focuses on a port, but if this port space partially is not needed anymore and you can do other things with it, then you also need reconsideration of zoning, for example. You need to also focus substantially more on connections between floating spaces, smaller islands, and larger coastlines. So in that sense, urban and regional planning are very important to connect these spaces to each other. And the floating cities, I mean, who will build the first one? We will see there are enough projects that I would think that one of them actually gets realized during the next 10 years. But even if you don't see a kind of floating city anyway, in Europe, a lot of people think this is some place that needs to have a cathedral, you know, some big church, otherwise it's not a city. So I prefer speaking of floating settlements, because it doesn't sound so dramatic, I think. Upscaling this is possible, but I mean, the question is, can you really go to a place for 12,000 people, or will you first go to 2, 3, 4-story buildings, considering that the 2-story floating homes are already possible? And with 3, 4 stories of floors, you can already do quite a lot of things, not necessarily for residential purposes, but as I mentioned, there are a variety of other purposes, commercial purposes. If you want to have restaurants, if you want to have places for renting sports equipment and so on, for water reservoir, this is all already feasible.
Hi. Building off of that, I was actually a bit curious about the feasibility of amphibious architecture in places such as maybe the Maldives. So I guess in Singapore, you kind of have the financial backing and the facilities to create floating architecture to the bay. But in places like the Maldives, it's mostly a rural area, and the place is hundreds of kilometers from the nearest. And there's also talks about the Maldives is going to be sinking in the next 100 years. So in a situation like that, with a country full of people in the middle of the ocean, what's the feasibility for to survive?
So Maldives is an interesting example because you have a very low number of islands, especially the main island and the capital, Malé, where you have a very, very high population density, because there is also not enough housing available for people, which is a serious social issue also. If you have several generations in one home, this can be enjoyable, but if it's really the outcome of necessity, it's a different situation than if it's an intentional decision. So in that sense, the real estate prices in the Maldives, in certain parts of the Maldives, are very high. So building individual floating homes, I'm not talking about kind of floating settlement, but a large number of individual floating homes that are clustered to form something like an urban quarter is pretty feasible. It is not cheap, but at the same time, the very high real estate prices arguably artificially increase the feasibility for such a project. At the same time, I mean, we are talking about areas that are close to the capital. That is indeed the case. Distance is indeed a factor that has an impact here. So it's more that you are anyway adding to already inhabited coastlines, and the feasibility, I mean, of building something far away from inhabited coastlines, that there is a certain feasibility in the sense that there are very few spots in the ocean where the ocean is actually not very deep. 3, 4 spots that you can imagine, but at the same time, I mean, my question then to people is, what do you do there? Yeah.
Yes. Can you introduce yourself also, just before you ask the question? I think that's fine. Yeah.
Hi. So I'm Janice from NUS ISS, and I'm actually from the healthcare industry. So my question is related to that. So acceptance aside, assuming there's a proliferation of these there will be more communal needs. So I'm thinking, for example, say a hospital. Imagine a situation where there's sensitive facilities like operating theatre. So my question is, do you have any examples of whether a floating hospital or some kind of healthcare facility has ever been built? Or if not, stability, meaning that other specific challenges, right, that would be necessary to overcome as such facilities?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, in terms of hospitals and so on, I mean, there are hospital ships, for example, that are mobile stations that you can move from place to place for a variety of reasons, including, for example, earthquake relief and so on. So in that sense, building a floating hospital is feasible. At the same time, I mean, if structures, floating homes, floating commercial buildings are connected to terrestrial coastlines, I mean, you have a direct connection anyway. That means that, I mean, any terrestrial hospital could be used. So that there's the question which facilities, which services, which forms of urbanization are best partially moved to aquatic surfaces. For hospital, you could argue that if you have very calm waters, it's feasible. If you don't have the situation, I mean, a hospital is maybe something that you would want to keep on land and then move other structures onto the water. But I mean, there are also important considerations when we talk about connections here, the jetties and so on, leading to floating structures to have actually to provide access to rescue services or firefighters and so on. So that is also important to make sure that this is regulated in a way that no emergency turns into a disaster.
There's a question. Okay, here first.
I noticed that there are 3 stories. So first question is that the maximum number of stories? And second question is that if the platform is semi-floating, can we build more stories?
I mean, this depends on the structure. Here for this one, I think because it's an office building, 3 stories is already a noteworthy size. For other structures like homes, I mean, there are also 2 or 3 stories. One can build higher, ideally with larger platforms that then, or platforms that are at least connected to each other that then create more stability. So that is a consideration. I mean, so there's vertical expansion that also relates to the horizontal expansion. But it also depends on how calm your waters are, what you would do, and it also, I mean, depends on the additional weight on the structure. So in the case of some of the early floating homes in the Netherlands, for example, if you have a piano, it can already mean that you notice, because of the weight, that there's something happening with your house. So all these things need to be considered. But I mean, there is enough research on the topic that this is increasingly going, I would say, to 4 or 5 stories levels. High rises is something that I think is at the moment something worthy of research, but I think not.
I think there was a question on the other side first. The end, the far end. I think he raised his hand first.
I'm Ijat from NUS Civil Engineering, undergraduate student. So my question is, given that you mentioned if Singapore society was to implement the floating structures and platforms, right, then would there be some social impacts, like since it's a new technology, the facilities and infrastructure might be more expensive? it might cause some sort of social segregations. Like, it might not be. Oh, sorry. It might not be very accessible to people of like low income or certain backgrounds, or it could affect people with disabilities or those elderly where it might not be accessible for them. So I want to hear your thoughts on this issue. Thank you.
Actually, I had this question also because you talk about real estate, right? So I was also curious, what do you perceive in the future as when this solution become more high tech? Because in the past it was low tech, so perceived as not very classy. But as the high tech solutions emerge, right? Do you perceive this as being something premium? I mean, or the real estate in the ocean, or maybe it's still like low class? Yeah. So arising from the question from the audience also.
I mean, this is I think, very important question because, I mean, it is related to the topic of the social acceptance and the question also of income levels and so on. It very much depends on a variety of factors. If you have subsidies, for example, in the form of public housing, or if you don't have that. It also depends on, for example, the potentially already existing urbanization along coastlines. So if you were to build structures very close to Sentosa, you can imagine that this is probably a bit more pricey than if you go to certain other places, maybe further in the north. So there is this dimension, but I mean, this is really dependent on, and this is also what I argue for, more consideration of aquatic spaces in planning. So, I mean, I cannot tell you anything about water value or about legal structures. For example, you would almost certainly not be able to buy any aquatic space. You would only be allowed to rent it. I think governments have a tendency not to sell any aquatic spaces, especially not when we talk about more maritime spaces. And the acceptance, I think, also depends very much on how aesthetic such structures look. I mean, this is a factor, I think, for a variety of situations. When we talk about buildings, I mean, extreme concrete buildings, for example, that defined many of the communist countries, were seen as some, serious social issue in terms of the lack of aesthetics. So integrating buildings into local architectural styles and so on can help here. And there's a variety of other factors that also happen here. That there is a question in theory, how many floating solar panels would people be okay to see along coastlines? It's speculation. I don't have any data on it. I mean, it would be helpful for sure. At the same time, I mean, it's also possible that there's just this idea that you want to see natural spaces. So this is also a question to a certain degree of education and also of knowledge. So, but without any surveys, any data, it's also difficult generally to answer.
It's a branding issue, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the lady there had a question, yes.
Yeah, sorry, I had two.
Okay, please, can you introduce yourself first?
I'm Adele. I am a research engineer from the Mechanical Engineering Department. And what was it? First, I wanted to ask, could you clarify what you meant by the ontological shift, making architecture go backwards? That was a very interesting statement right there. And then there was also since we see floating structures as low-tech, well, now we've kind of branded it as low-tech, and it is low-tech. And we've essentially stopped existing people from using that low-tech structure in favor of terrestrial. How can we convince them to move back to that sort of structure if we're going to see an amphibious change? I know there's social acceptance, and we want to include it in university curricula. But how does that trickle down to the coastal populations who have already been sort of sort of looked down upon for using these low tech, and now we have to convince them that we've essentially gentrified their structures by a high tech solution, correct? So within these coastal populations, how would we reintroduce it to them essentially?
Yeah, and first thing that I want to mention, the gentrification. I mean, it can be a good thing. It can also be, used in a negative way, and people are critical of it. But there is the fact that, for example, initially in the Netherlands, the hippie houseboats, so to speak, as low-tech structures were gentrified into floating homes, because you have substantially different facilities available to you, and also substantial change in the value of these structures from home or self-built houseboats, potentially into potential investments in an aquatic urbanization project. So that is a factor, but more generally, what I very early mentioned is that, 10 years ago, 10% of the people in the room, but 100 years ago, maybe nobody, because you could just go to the shoreline and see a lot of these floating structures and stilted structures. It would not have been something really interesting or new. So I think our mental shift to terrestrial urbanization somewhat removed them. But I also think it's not really too difficult to bring them back. I mean, there's an association with backwardness, as I mentioned. I think this is an issue for social acceptance. But at the same time, if you get the chance to not only see, but maybe also enter some floating structures, so the construction of a couple of prototypes, I think would very much help people becoming familiar with them as a high-tech solution. I think it's to a certain degree already happening with floating solar PV systems, and visits to them, for example, also serve to familiarize people with these possibilities. So, yeah, it's familiar enough, I think, that really some education and more consideration can solve this problem.
Okay, there are two. Okay, the one at the back first, I think I raised his hand first. Yes.
So, I am a young undergraduate student from so may I know about the carbon footprint of the and the potential for recycling of the material used in floating infrastructures?
Yeah, okay. There are two components. One component is that, I mentioned the mobility of these structures. You can relocate them in case they are not needed anymore at a certain location, and they can be used at a different location. So there is no need for demolition. So in a number of settings, where, for example, the value of the ground on which you're building a building is very high compared to the cost of the building, it can easily make sense to demolish the building after years or a couple of decades and build a new one. Here in the case, you would not have this situation. You can always relocate it. If this then really happens, is something, this is something to be found out. But think of all sorts of other floating devices. Think of ships. Think of floating platforms from all sorts of industries. They are usually relocated if they are not used at a certain place anymore. The entire offshore oil industry is based on moving some of the exploration platforms from one side to another. So this is possible. The other topic is the recycling of the structures. I mean, one point I want to mention is that I think parts of the float at Marina Bay actually were used for the construction work that happened, and that is still happening on the site. But arguably more important is when we talk about expanded polystyrene, this is something that you can, with some effort, also not recycle necessarily from a floating home, but you can recycle it from already used plastics. I mean, EPS is, I mean, go to a food court, do a takeaway. I mean, this is stuff in the end. I mean, there's no lack of it. I mean, this is all, to a certain degree, legal questions that need to be implemented. There can be cost increases and so on, but I mean, I think the recycling is important, and in the long run, it probably also saves money in the long run.
Yeah, it's good to see our young undergraduates are being concerned about sustainability and this kind of issues. So actually, I have one question about the word floating. So is it is it specifically has to float, or is it anything in water? Because earlier in the slides you also mentioned some structures in water earlier on the stilts, right? So yeah, maybe also clarify your society. Does it cover?
Our society focuses on floating solutions, but I think it's important to also mention stilted structures. And one thing I briefly mentioned, but I want to mention again, there are some benefits when we talk about stilted structures compared to low-tech floating structures. When we talk about cooling and so on, I don't want to go into the details here, but when we talk about high-tech structures, there is the big issue that you cannot really easily remove of very difficult access to stilted structures if they are based in aquatic regions. So, I mean, nobody wants to, at least here in a high-income context, climb a rope to reach the home. Or if you have stairs that are, as I mentioned, slippery, this is also an issue and would also not be appealing to physically disabled people or elderly people. So there are a number of factors that, in my opinion, also the opinion of the society, discourages the use of stilted structures. Therefore, the focus on floating structures. But this is also very briefly that there is a difference when we talk about terrestrial situations. When we talk about terrestrial situations, an amphibious house that sits on the ground and during a flooding event actually goes up with the water level and then sinks again with the water level, that is a consideration, but this is something that is meant for a different zone when we talk here about urban planning.
Yes. Aaron, I'm a master's architecture student in the NUS. So I have a question about the materials that are used in floating architectures and stilted structures. So generally, is concrete better to be used, or maybe steel columns? And a second part to this question is, what are some criteria that you have in terms of the materials like concrete? So generally, when I've been researching, some people say that it's very good to have like very long-lasting concrete that is resistant to erosion. But then I hear that a lot of this concrete is not very good for the marine biology in the surrounding areas. And I'm kind of reminded of decommissioned oil rigs, where the structures kind of become these artificial reef systems. And I was wondering if these kind of that kind of concrete that you use can either promote or inhibit this sort of artificial reef systems and biology that can be attracted in the area. And a final part to it. In this sort of situation, is in a sense corals growing on structures, is it going to affect its structural integrity? Yes, thank you.
Okay, I mean, regarding the use of materials, there are different approaches, and it also depends on what structure we are talking about. But I mean, for floating homes, for example, the main use is EPS and then concrete as a protective layer around it. So yeah, and I mentioned this is easier to do in freshwater than it is in saltwater. So the lifespan in saltwater, even with good maintenance, is substantially shorter than in freshwater. There are also some issues, as I mentioned, with impacts on the ecosystem around it, which is something that should be studied. So I already mentioned, I mean, there's a biofouling community that inevitably will start colonizing any floating structure. There is, because of the use of certain materials, a pre-selection of what species would settle there. So this has an impact, which you can nevertheless, to a certain degree, modify through these microhabitats that I mentioned. So you can encourage, by rebuilding natural habitats, structures that are beneficial for the settlement of certain species that may also not be affected that much, for example, by any releases from the concrete. But yeah, as mentioned, this is also a topic that deserves more studies.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Hi, I'm Jiarui. I'm a master's in environmental management student here in NUS. So I'd like to ask a question from a public policy angle. So you know how in Singapore, right, we are always talking about land scarcity, like increasing house prices. How far are we from a reality where we can actually adopt this at scale and make it more like we scale up to weave it into our public housing strategy or private housing, whatever it is, to just enable us to live more on water? Yeah.
That is, I mean, a question that I think to a certain degree can come up with the redevelopment of port spaces. I mean, this structure, for example, in Busan for up to 12,000 people, that is not that big. I mean, it's by far smaller than Singapore Island. This is, I think, very obvious. And there's also, I think, more consideration in other countries. So it is, nevertheless, I think, also for a lot of governments easier to not be the very first one who tries something. And just because you're the second or the third one doesn't mean that it would not necessarily be unsuccessful. You can actually learn something from the first one. So I think that is an important note in the sense that I think Singaporean authorities also can follow what is happening in other countries, the Busan project and so on, and think about such ways forward. There is also, I mean, the possibility to focus on not high-rises, but smaller real estate in places where the land value is so high that single-family homes are actually feasible. There are some spaces, I think, in Singapore where this would be an option, but we would not talk about, I mean, noteworthy integration into public housing strategy. But generally, Singapore would have, in terms of its environmental conditions, it would be in a very good situation to integrate larger residential structures, either via funding research on them or by waiting until this happens in other countries.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jojo, an architecture student at NUS. I'm curious about the territorial rights regarding floating settlements. Currently, our land boundary is also defined by the shape of the sea. As we develop further into water, especially in like disputed waters, for example, could floating settlements be used as a form of sovereign creep where nations attempt to extend their territorial claims through artificial means? And does that mean that floating settlements are somewhat political then?
I think they are political, but I think you would not find any state that would try to do that. I mean, there is a long history also here actually involving Singaporean politicians like Tommy Koh and so on with the law of the sea. There are long discussions about the legal status of artificial islands, floating structures, and so on. None of them is creating any territorial claim other than that if you are outside of an EEZ, exclusive economic zone, and also when you are inside it, you like a ship basically on the structure have sovereign rights. So, but there's no claim to any waters around it. And this is a discussion that goes back even to times before the Law of the Sea conferences in the 1970s, 1980s, when the first question came up in the 1920s related to floating airports that in the end were not built because aircraft carriers turned out to be more efficient. But there was a discussion among a lot of politicians, diplomats and so on, would these floating airports actually create a kind of territorial claim to the waters around them? And then it was very easily found out, no, we don't want that, because it would increase safety concerns substantially. Somebody moves a floating airport very close to your own coastline, even if you would stay outside of the territorial sea that was pretty short in the early 20th century. I mean, you can imagine that a surprise attack, for example, would be an issue. So if there were ever a situation in which there were territorial claim, states would do all sorts of aggressive things, all sorts of things that I think are not desirable in the international community, so I don't see this ever happening.
On the other hand, if there's no territorial claims, then would the law still apply to these floating settlements? Yeah, I mean, how safe are you? Are protected by the law?
Yeah, I mean, the further you go out into the ocean, I mean, the more you are reliant at the end of the day on satellites and so on, and also on a limited number of countries that can support you. I mean, think about, for example, a lot of countries in the Pacific Ocean that are actually not able to defend their fisheries places against fisheries vessels from certain countries. You can, even if you spot them with a satellite, it doesn't mean that you can prevent them because you may not have the vessels to do that. But there are also, I mean, maybe you have come across some ideas for the settlements far out in the ocean. I think if this ever becomes possible, the resulting situation would be that a number of great powers would come together and more or less unilaterally decide to extend the exclusive economic zones so far that all the ocean is covered. As long as you're in an exclusive economic zone of a country, you are not really able to do what you want. So in that sense, providing safety, security, and so on is important. Along coastlines, I don't see the problem, but I think for a lot of people, there's more the concern that you cannot really escape the state, so to speak. I mean, the libertarians that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The only one who's fine.
Terrestrial areas where cities encroach more and more into forests or green areas. What are your views on the potential risks of us encroaching more into within the marine territories and sensitive habitats? I mean, suppose floating cities or floating settlements grow, assume there will also be more demands for services with boats. More human noise, discharges and all. Yeah, what are your views on that? As these things are enabled and permitted. Thank you.
So I did really acoustically.
Yeah. I think it was a bit soft.
Yeah, it was a bit too soft, sorry.
Maybe could you just repeat again? I think, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah? So my name is Evelyn from With the Finn and Boss. I was just thinking about human nature. I think even in terrestrial settlements, we have encroached more and more into, for example, forest habitats. What are your views on the risks of us encroaching more within the marine territories? Surely, as settlements in the sea grow, our demands for services, be it through boats or would also increase sea traffic and also disturbance on the marine habitats. What are your views on that? Thank you.
I mean, that there's one general thing to say. You cannot have any population growth without environmental impacts. And you cannot have urban growth without environmental impacts. So whether it's urban growth on land or on the sea surface, there will be impacts, and then you can decide to compare these impacts and maybe decide that certain impacts are probably all negative, that they are the lesser evil, so to speak. And when we talk about impacts on marine environments, there are a number of ways how you can actually reduce or minimize them. I mean, there is, for example, an issue of light pollution of marine spaces. The urbanization in combination with access to electricity, I mean, has meant that a lot of cities are now very easily visible on nighttime satellite images that show, nighttime illumination. And this light is so strong that it not only has an impact on terrestrial animals and so on that get confused and their biological clocks change, but this can also happen to marine life, for example. But you can change that by actually changing to certain colors in the spectrum. Using red light, for example, is an option that then actually means, in contrast, for example, to green lights, that marine life is not really bothered by it. Whereas fishing vessels would use this green light, for example, to attract fish and other organisms to the sea surface for fishing purposes. So you can do a lot of things in that way. You can also reduce the sound impacts, for example, by a variety of options in which you switch from diesel generators, for example, that are pretty noisy, to other ways of energy generation, electricity generation, when we talk about solar energy, for example. And yeah, that there's a spectrum of possibilities, but I think this is also something that needs by far more research in the future.
Any further questions from the audience here? We have a few questions online from. Yeah, maybe I can just, while we are thinking about questions, maybe just ask on behalf of the online audience. So Peter Robbins from the Floating Economy, I'm not sure if you will know him.
Yeah.
He has quite a number of questions, so he can contact you directly. I will just pick up a few. So his first question is on what role do you see autonomous systems and AI playing in the near future for floating settlements and structures?
I mean, when I think about AI, for example, I often think first of options, for example, for fish farming and so on, not directly about urbanization, but I mean, in terms of transportation, I think it's very important. If you have an increasing urbanization along coastlines, on land and in the water, there's a increasing demand likely for some form of water taxis. And I mean, think of Grab, GoCheck, and so on. You associate this with land-based solutions, but I mean, you can also, I mean, use this for any water-based transportation method. This is something that is in the process of growing, but yeah, I mean, in terms of I think ride-hailing systems, this is something that matters for aquatic urbanization.
Right. Okay, maybe let me ask another question from on behalf of Peter Robbins. You spoke a bit about energy, but maybe you can elaborate a bit more. What are the main forms of energy that will most likely be effective for floating settlements? Yeah.
I mean, it depends on what we are talking about. If we were to talk about a structure that is too far away from the terrestrial public grid, you would have to rely on some kind of storage system, be that batteries or hydrogen that can either be delivered to such a settlement, or that can be generated on site. When we talk about here floating energy generation, I mean, tomorrow is the and on Wednesday is the Asia Energy Week, where we also, as a society, will be present with a couple of presentations. The big topics are floating solar PV system and floating nuclear power plants. So both of them could be options. Floating nuclear power plants do exist. I mean, there's one in Russia that is operating since a couple of years. There are a growing number of energy companies that are in the process of doing research and developing them in a more Western context. There are also new guidelines. American Bureau of Shipping released some last year. And in terms of floating solar panels, there's already substantial research, and the big question or the big transition is now from freshwater, usually water reservoirs, to coastal spaces in marine waters. So this is, I think, in terms of energy generation, when we talk about floating solutions, the current situation.
I think we have covered most of the key questions and ideas. There's Craig Lewis who wants to explore working with you in your organization in developing the first sea range farm in Singapore. I think he could get in touch with you and then you could communicate privately, or you want to answer this question?
Yeah, we are very happy to talk about that, to provide some advice. Just go to the website of the society. It's very easy. I mean, I think my contact data are also here on the slides. One thing to mention for the Singaporean context, the energy prices and the labor costs are high. So any fish farm is a very ambitious idea. Let's put it this way.
Okay. Yes. So thank you very much for coming to this interesting lecture and then providing ideas and then comments and questions.
We would also like to thank Dr. Stefan for giving us his valuable time to share his thoughts, vision, and ideas. We would also like to thank Prof. Low for his time as well as his moderation for this session. I'm sure we all have learned a lot from this lecture. Thank you everyone for attending this lecture and actively participating with your questions. So please watch out for our social media channels as well as your emails where we will be informing you about our future lectures. Thank you and good night.